The first time I saw myself standing in front of the mirror wearing nothing more unusual than a pair of black pantyhose beneath my everyday clothes, I realized I had spent years hiding from someone who had quietly been waiting for me all along. It wasn't about fashion. It wasn't about pretending to be someone else. It certainly wasn't about chasing attention. It was something I couldn't explain, even to myself. Every time I tried to put it into words, the feeling slipped away like smoke. All I knew was that whenever I held a pair of black pantyhose in my hands, my heartbeat slowed instead of racing. The noise inside my mind became quieter. That frightened me. For years, I convinced myself it was just a passing curiosity. Something I'd eventually outgrow, like childhood hobbies or old dreams that faded with time. Instead, the feeling only grew stronger. I lived what most people would call an ordinary life. I worked in a busy office, laughed with colleagues, attended family gatherings, and blended into every crowd I entered. People described me as dependable, practical, even predictable. If they had known what occupied my thoughts every evening after closing my apartment door, they would have been shocked. My wardrobe looked completely ordinary, except for one drawer. Hidden beneath folded sweaters sat a small black box. Inside it were neatly folded pairs of black pantyhose, arranged almost like treasured photographs. Different textures, different finishes, some perfectly matte, others slightly sheer. Yet they all shared the same color, black. Friends often joked that everyone had strange collections. Mine simply stayed invisible. Every few weeks I would promise myself that this was the last time. I'd open the drawer, stare at the box and think, this ends today. Somehow it never did. One rainy autumn evening everything changed. The city outside my apartment windows disappeared behind streaks of rain. Streetlights reflected across the wet pavement like golden rivers. I made coffee, turned off my phone and sat in silence. The apartment felt unusually peaceful. Without really thinking, I opened the drawer. There they were. Perfectly folded. Untouched for weeks. I picked up one pair, letting the soft fabric slide gently through my fingers. People often ask why black. I think the answer begins there. Black never asked questions. It never demanded attention. It wasn't loud. It wasn't trying to prove anything. Simply existed. The color carried confidence without shouting. It felt timeless, elegant, almost protective. Somehow, it allowed me to explore feelings I couldn't describe while still giving me a sense of privacy. That night I carefully put them on. The familiar sensation returned immediately. Not excitement but calm. Like stepping into a version of myself that had been waiting patiently. I stood before the mirror. For years I'd avoided looking directly into my own reflection during moments like this. I'd glance quickly, then look away, afraid of what I might discover. This time I forced myself to stay. The mirror became my silent companion. First I only noticed small details. The way I stood. The way my posture softened. The way my nervous expression slowly disappeared. Nothing dramatic had changed. Yet somehow everything felt different. It wasn't the clothing. It was permission. For the first time in my life, I wasn't judging myself. I simply observed. My reflection didn't look like someone pretending. It looked like someone finally relaxing. That realization caught me completely off guard. I actually smiled. It was a tiny smile. But it felt genuine. The next morning, however, reality returned. The mirror reflected the same office worker everyone expected to see. The hidden drawer remained closed. The black box disappeared beneath sweaters once again. On the train to work, I couldn't stop thinking about the night before. Questions echoed endlessly. Was I hiding because I was ashamed? Or was I ashamed because I'd spent so many years hiding? The difference mattered. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of the answer. That afternoon my colleague Emma noticed I seemed distracted. "You look different today," she said. I laughed nervously. "Different how?" "I don't know," she replied with a smile. "Calmer." Just one word. Calmer. She had no idea how deeply that simple observation affected me. 'Cause she was right. Nothing about my appearance had changed. But something inside me had. That evening, instead of rushing home with uncertainty, I walked slowly through the city. Store windows reflected strangers passing beneath glowing signs. Every reflection reminded me of the mirror waiting in my apartment. The mirror had become more than glass. It had become a question. Who are you when no one else is watching? I didn't yet know the answer, but for the first time I wanted to find it. As I unlocked my apartment door that night, I had no idea someone from my past was about to unexpectedly step back into my life and unknowingly challenge everything I thought I understood about myself. The knock on my apartment door came just as I had set my keys on the kitchen counter. It was late enough that I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a brief second my heart raced for reasons that had nothing to do with the visitor. The black box was still sitting on my bed from the previous evening. I hadn't tucked it back into its hiding place. When I opened the door, I froze. Daniel. We had been friends since university. The kind of friends who could go months without speaking and then continue a conversation as though no time had passed. His smile hadn't changed, but there was a quiet tiredness behind his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. "I was nearby," he said with an apologetic grin. "Thought I'd surprise you." "You definitely succeeded." As he stepped inside, I tried to act naturally while my thoughts sprinted toward the bedroom. I hoped he wouldn't wander in there. Fortunately, he settled onto the sofa while I made coffee, and we slipped into familiar conversation. We spoke about work, old classmates, forgotten road trips, and the strange way adulthood had arrived without asking permission. Then his expression became serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Have you ever felt like you've spent years acting out a version of yourself just because everyone expected it?" His question landed with surprising force. I looked at him, unsure whether he somehow knew my secret. "I think everyone feels that sometimes," I answered carefully. He nodded. "Maybe. But lately I've realized I've been living almost entirely for other people's expectations." Those words echoed through my apartment. Other people's expectations. After Daniel left, I stood silently by the window, watching the city lights shimmer beneath another gentle rainfall. The mirror waited. The black box waited. So did the question. Who was I when nobody else was watching? That evening I didn't rush. Instead of treating the moment like a guilty secret, I moved slowly, almost respectfully. I unfolded the familiar pair of black pantyhose with careful hands. The fabric caught the soft bedroom light. People often imagine transformation as something dramatic, like a switch being flipped. Mine was quieter. It lived inside tiny decisions. Standing taller, breathing deeper, allowing myself to stop apologizing for feelings I hadn't even chosen. As I looked into the mirror again, I noticed something I had overlooked before. The mirror wasn't changing me. It was introducing me. I began experimenting with simple, understated outfits. Nothing extravagant. Just clean lines, comfortable fabrics, soft colors. The black pantyhose remained constant beneath everything else, almost like an invisible thread connecting every version of myself. Whenever uncertainty returned, I remembered how calm I had felt wearing them. They became my anchor, not because they were magical, because they reminded me to stop pretending. Weeks passed. My confidence grew in ways that surprised me. I smiled more naturally. I listened more patiently. I stopped feeling the need to perform confidence because genuine confidence was quietly taking its place. Ironically, people around me noticed. Emma smiled one morning as we walked into the office together. "I've figured it out." And blinked. "Figured what out?" "Whatever you've been doing lately. Keep doing it." I laughed nervously. "Why? You seem happier." Just one sentence. Yet it stayed with me all day. Happier. Nobody had discovered my hidden drawer. Nobody had seen the mirror conversations. Nobody knew about the black pantyhose folded carefully beneath my clothes. They were simply noticing the result. That frightened me almost as much as it encouraged me. If people could sense that something had changed, how long would it be before someone started asking deeper questions? That fear returned every evening. Sometimes I'd stand in front of the mirror and wonder whether I should throw everything away. Life would certainly become simpler. No more worrying. No more secrets. No more internal debates. I even picked up the black box one night, determined to carry it to the rubbish bin outside. Halfway to the apartment door I stopped. The box wasn't heavy, yet my arms suddenly felt as though they were carrying years of silence. I turned around, slowly, carefully, and placed it back inside the drawer. Not because I wanted to hide again, because I realized I wasn't ready to erase a part of myself simply to make life easier. That decision marked a turning point. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this part of me?" I started asking, "How do I live honestly with it?" The answer didn't come immediately, but it began arriving in unexpected places. An article about self-acceptance, podcast discussing authenticity, conversations with people who had overcome completely different fears yet described emotions identical to mine. The details of our stories were different. The feelings were universal. Fear, shame, hope, relief. One Saturday afternoon I decided to do something that terrified me. I visited a quiet clothing boutique on the other side of the city where nobody knew me. My hands shook as I walked through the entrance. Every customer seemed busy with their own shopping, yet I felt as though every eye was watching me. I almost turned around. Then I remembered the mirror. I remembered the calm. I remembered the question. Who are you when nobody else is watching? Except now. People were watching. Or at least I believed they were. A friendly shop assistant approached with a warm smile. "Can I help you find anything?" For one long second I couldn't speak. Then I quietly answered, "Yes, I think I'd like some advice." She smiled exactly the same way she had before asking the question. No surprise. No judgment. Just kindness. In that ordinary moment, one of the biggest fears I'd carried for years began to lose its grip. But as I left the shop carrying a small paper bag, I looked across the street, and my heart nearly stopped. Standing at the pedestrian crossing was someone I recognized instantly. Someone from work. Someone who was looking directly in my direction. For a split second, the noise of the city disappeared. Traffic lights changed. People crossed the road. Someone laughed nearby. But all I could focus on was the familiar face standing on the opposite pavement. It was Mark. He worked 2 desks away from me. We weren't close friends, but we shared enough conversations over coffee that he recognized me instantly. My grip tightened around the paper shopping bag. My mind immediately imagined the worst. He knows. He's wondering what's inside the bag. He's going to tell everyone. The stories I created inside my own head arrived much faster than reality ever could. Before I had time to decide whether to turn away, Mark lifted his hand and waved. "Hey!" I forced a smile and waved back. He walked across the crossing as naturally as if we'd bumped into each other at the supermarket. "What are the chances?" he laughed. "I know. You live around here. Not far. I've just been buying a birthday present for my sister," he said, holding up his own shopping bag. "Shopping isn't really my favorite weekend activity." I smiled politely, still waiting for the conversation to become uncomfortable. Never did. He asked about work. We talked about the weather. He mentioned an upcoming project. Then he wished me a good weekend and continued walking. That was it. He never glanced at my bag. Never asked what I'd bought. Never gave me the suspicious look I had imagined dozens of times. As he disappeared into the crowd, I stood there feeling strangely embarrassed. Not because of him. Because of myself. I had spent years believing everyone else was constantly judging me.
Yet in reality most people were simply living their own lives. That realization stayed with me for weeks. It didn't erase my fears overnight, but it weakened them. Little by little. Like sunlight melting frost. Back home I placed the shopping bag beside the mirror. Inside was another pair of black pantyhose. Simple. Elegant. Comfortable. Nothing extravagant. As I unfolded them, I noticed how different I felt compared to the first pair I'd ever bought. Back then every purchase carried guilt. This one carried gratitude. The mirror reflected the same room it always had. The same bookshelf. The same curtains. The same quiet apartment. Yet every time I stood before it, the reflection became a little more honest. I started keeping a journal. Not about clothes. Not about appearances. About emotions. Every page answered one question. How did I feel today? Some entries were hopeful. Some were full of doubt. Others contained only a single sentence. Today I wasn't afraid of my own reflection. Months passed. The seasons changed. Autumn leaves gave way to winter mornings dusted with frost. The hidden drawer no longer felt like a prison. Felt like a chapter. One evening, while organizing old photographs, I found a picture of myself from several years earlier. I barely recognized the expression. I looked successful. Confident. Perfectly ordinary. But my eyes seemed exhausted. As though they were asking for permission to rest. I placed the photograph beside the mirror. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The older version of me had spent enormous energy trying to become acceptable to everyone else. The person standing in front of the mirror now wasn't trying nearly as hard. Ironically, life had become lighter. Emma noticed another change one afternoon. You've started smiling with your eyes. I laughed. I didn't know smiles had different versions. They do, she replied. Some are polite. Some are real. Her words lingered long after the conversation ended. That evening I walked through a nearby park. The wind carried the scent of pine trees and damp earth. Children laughed near the lake. An elderly couple walked hand in hand. A teenager sat alone sketching the sunset. Everyone seemed to be carrying invisible stories. Invisible fears. Invisible dreams. Mine simply happened to include a mirror and a drawer filled with carefully folded black pantyhose. For the first time I didn't see that as something shameful. I saw it as one thread in the much larger fabric of who I was. Not my entire identity. Just one meaningful part of it. A few weeks later, Daniel invited me to dinner. Halfway through the meal, he looked at me thoughtfully. You've changed. I smiled. So everyone keeps telling me. No, he said gently. You've stopped pretending. I stared at my cup of tea. He couldn't possibly know everything. Yet somehow he'd recognized the outcome without ever seeing the journey. I've been trying to understand myself, I admitted. He nodded. I think that's one of the bravest things anyone can do. Neither of us spoke for a while. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt respectful. As though neither of us needed to explain every chapter of our lives to understand one another. Walking home beneath the evening lights, I realized something that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The thing I had feared most wasn't other people's rejection. It had been my own. Every harsh judgment. Every moment of shame. Every guilty thought. Most of it had come from me. And if I had learned to replace those thoughts with kindness, perhaps I could finally move forward. When I reached my apartment, I paused before the mirror once again. The familiar reflection looked back. This time I smiled first. The reflection smiled back without hesitation. For the first time in years, it felt less like looking into glass. And more like finally meeting an old friend. But one final conversation still awaited me. A conversation that would determine whether I could carry this quiet confidence beyond the walls of my apartment and into the rest of my life.